Yes, sir. Oh, okay. All right. I'm sorry. Sure. Good luck. All right. Now, in terms of the number of questions from each chapter, I don't have the exact breakdown. I glanced at it. It looks like it's about an even split. So chapter 18, chapter 28, and chapter 29 look like they have about the same number of questions. All questions, all of them are multiple choice with 5 answers. I believe there is one image on the exam that you'll have to identify parts on. I usually don't put anatomy stuff on there, but there is one image. I would say look in your book at the different follicles. Okay, the image question has to do with some of the structures you find on the follicles, pointing to parts of the follicles and having to identify them. Okay? Yeah, exactly. Like, yeah. If you want to hold that up and show it around for everyone. So, look at those. I'm pretty sure you don't have to identify the trophy blast, but for sure. All right. So here we go. I'm just going to crank through this stuff. Chapter 18 then was the endocrine system. Endocrine system's a lot like what other system? Nervous system, right? They communicate. They integrate the body into a whole. Okay. What are the chemicals that the nervous system uses to communicate? Neurotransmitters. What does the endocrine system use? Hormones. Okay. Which they both do the same thing, but which acts more quickly? Nervous system. Okay. Endocrine system. Why does it take more? Why is it more slow? Right. You got to put the stuff into the blood, then you got to wait for it to get to its target organ or whatever, and then it's going to have an effect. Okay. The flip side of that, though, is which lasts longer? Nervous or endocrine? Endocrine. Endocrine. Okay, you still have to get the hormones out of your blood for them to stop having an effect. Okay, either via the kidneys or via the liver. All right. Now, what are the two types of? Let me just back up. What are the two types of glands in the body?
Exocrine and endocrine.
Exocrine and endocrine. What do exocrine have? Ducts. Endocrine don't. Okay. So basically with an endocrine gland, it's secreting its material, it's secreting the hormones into the interstitial fluid, and then the hormones diffuse into nearby blood vessels and are carried someplace far away in the body. Okay. What are some of the functions, or what are some of the things that hormones can control? They can control metabolism, right? What hormone does that? Principally. Your thyroid hormones, your T3 and your T4 are important with that. Balance and composition of volume and body fluids, what does that? ADH as well as what? What controls like sodium reabsorption in the kidneys? Aldosterone, remember that one? Okay. Direct the rate and timing of growth and development. That's what hormone is in charge of growth? Growth hormone, okay? Among others. Emergency control, what's your stress hormone? Cortisol, all right? So emergency control during physical and mental stress, that's another function. And then we have a number of hormones that are involved in reproductive functions. What are some of the hormones that are involved in reproductive functions?
Luteinizing hormone.
Luteinizing hormone, FSH, follicular stimulating hormone, what else? Testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, so many of them, right? Lots and lots of them. By the way, I told my other class, I had the talk last night with my 10-year-old son. Went over. It was awesome. I started pulling out like microscope slides of the primary follicle, and he just was like, this really didn't live up to his expectations. He thought it was going to be racy or something. It was like, I just snoozed him. I just put him right to sleep. I got an excruciating detail about this. Fertilization occurs in the infundibulum. Get it right.
He's going to be a hit on the school bus today.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, he's going to get beaten up. All right. Endocrine system. Okay, fine. What are some of the endocrine glands? So let's start superior. What do you got?
Pituitary.
Pituitary. What else?
Hypothalamus.
Pineal.
Pineal.
Pineal. What else?
Thyroid.
Thyroid. What else?
Parathyroid.
Parathyroid. What's the kind of weird one that's in here? Thymus, which is more lymphatic system. What as we keep going down? Adrenal glands. What else? Pancreas is there. Keep going down. If you're a woman, the ovaries and men, the testes. All right. So all of those classified. Other ones though. Remember, not all of them are exclusively endocrine glands. Okay. Even things like the kidneys, the heart, they can release hormones. Okay. Does anyone remember the hormone that the heart releases?
Atrial something.
Atrial natriuretic peptide. It causes you to pee out sodium. Your body releases it when your blood pressure is high. The sodium goes into your urine. The water follows. That brings down your blood pressure because your blood volume goes down. What was the hormone that came from adipose tissue? Leptin, which does what? Yeah, it suppresses hunger, suppresses your appetite. Right? At least it's supposed to.
It's not working.
And you have something like the placenta, right, that puts out many hormones. Now, we were talking about hormones getting into the bloodstream, right? Do all hormones get into the bloodstream and go to someplace far away?
No.
No. What's the other those are called circulating hormones. What's the other category?
Local
hormones. What do they do?
They act on the...
They stay and they affect either nearby cells. What's that called when you affect a nearby cell? That's paracrine method. What's the other option?
Autocrine.
Yeah, you stimulate yourself, right? An autocrine type of a thing where you go back and stimulate yourself. Some immune system cells do that the autocrine way. Also, some immune system cells do it the paracrine way. But most of your hormones are the circulating type. They get secreted, they diffuse into the nearby blood vessels, and then they get taken to someplace far away. Do they act on all cells in the body then, if they're in the blood? No. What do they act on? Only the cells that have receptors, and it just depends on the particular hormone in terms of how widespread their receptors are. Okay. All right. We went on to classify hormones based on their structural and functional properties. What were the two categories based on solubility? Water soluble and lipid soluble. Okay. What's the implication in terms of the mechanism of action? How does a lipid soluble hormone work? It goes through the cell, goes right through the cell membrane. It can right. It's lipid soluble. It has no problem going through the phospholipid bilayer. Then what happens? Usually goes through the cytoplasm and then usually goes into the nucleus. And what does it do in the nucleus? It alters gene expression. So a lipid soluble hormone actually causes gene expression. In other words, it stimulates protein synthesis. It causes new proteins to be formed, and that's what has the effect. What about water soluble? How do they work? Yeah, they can't get into the cells, right? They have to bind to a receptor on the cell membrane, and then what does that trigger on the inside? What forms on the inside? A second messenger. And then the second messenger has the effects, because the water-soluble hormone itself can't get into the cell. So the second messenger then carries out the effects. What's the most common second messenger? Anyone know? CAMP, cyclic AMP is the most common one. Okay. And then that CAMP can go. It can turn on various enzymes, which turn on other enzymes, which basically cause the effects of the water-soluble hormone. All right. Let's see. In terms of the lipid-soluble hormones, what were some examples of lipid-soluble hormones? Steroid hormones, right? All of those are derived from what chemical? Cholesterol. They're all derived from cholesterol. When you look at the name of a steroid hormone, how can you tell it's a steroid hormone? It ends in ONE or OL. Okay, so testosterone, aldosterone, progesterone. But estrogen is a group, and if you look at those individual ones like estradiol or estrone, they follow the same rule. What are some other lipid-soluble hormones? T3 and T4, your thyroid hormones, are lipid-soluble. What about, what's this? It's actually a little gas that acts like a vasodilator. Does anyone know what it is? Nitric oxide. Okay. Not nitrous oxide, because that's laughing gas. But nitric oxide, yeah, is the one. All right. Lipid-soluble hormones, can they just travel around freely in the blood?
No.
No, they need blood. They need a carrier protein to carry them around. All right. Some of the water-soluble hormones, some of them were derived from amines, like your so-called catecholamines, like epinephrine, norepinephrine, peptide and protein hormones, things like ADH, oxytocin, or peptide hormones, bigger things like insulin or protein hormones. Something called eicosanoid hormones. What are those? Yeah, they're derived from a 20-carbon fatty acid called what? Arachidonic acid. I keep meaning to look it up. I think there's something spider-related with how it looked. I don't know. But anyway, arachidonic acid, 20. They're all derived from that, and you're talking about your prostaglandins and your leukotrienes. Both of them are important in the inflammatory response. We'll talk about them later. But things like your NSAIDs basically stop the formation of the prostaglandins, and that's how they have the pain relieving effect. Okay, that looks pretty good. Okay. All right. What are some of the ways that you can regulate hormone secretion? Yeah, blood levels of a particular chemical. Okay. For example, the parathyroid glands monitor blood levels of what? Calcium, right? So changes in calcium. If calcium levels get low, parathyroid hormone will be released from the parathyroid glands, right? Likewise, you monitor for changes in calcium, and if calcium levels get high, what do you release? Calcitonin. Okay, see, chemical changes in the blood can cause hormone secretion. Signals from the nervous system, okay? Like, remember the adrenal medulla? What's coming from the adrenal medulla? What hormones? Norepinephrine and epinephrine, right? And I told you, for all intents and purposes, what can you think of the adrenal medulla as? It's basically like nervous tissue. It's basically like a sympathetic ganglion, right? So when the sympathetic nervous system signals the adrenal medulla, it will release those chemicals into the blood. So nervous system can control it. And then in the anterior pituitary, what controls the secretion of the hormones in the anterior pituitary? It's hypothalamus. What from the hypothalamus? Yeah, it's actually other hormones. It's releasing hormones from the hypothalamus or inhibiting hormones that control hormone secretion from the anterior pituitary. So nervous system, chemical changes in the blood, and other hormones can actually control and regulate hormone secretion. Most hormone secretion is regulated via positive or negative feedback?
Negative.
Mostly negative, correcting the problem. Okay. All right. What's the textbook example of positive feedback? Childbirth, right? Okay. We went on first then and talked about the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Anatomically, they're closely related. Anterior pituitary is glandular tissue, right? And as you said, it needs to get releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones to control its secretion from the hypothalamus. What's the little blood vessel network that goes to the anterior pituitary? Yeah, the hypophyseal portal system. Okay. What about the posterior pituitary? What does the posterior pituitary represent? It's basically just the ends of neurons that originate where? In the hypothalamus. So you have these neurons making, what are the hormones you have in the posterior pituitary? Oxytocin and ADH, also known as? And also known as vasopressin. Yeah, all of those are good. Okay. All right. Let's see. So you have these. What are the different anterior? What are the different anterior pituitary hormones? Some of them.
Growth hormone.
Don't all answer at once. Growth hormone,
Yeah.
also known as somatotropin. What else? Thyroid hormones come from the anterior pituitary. Thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, also known as thyrotropin. What else comes from the anterior?
LH.
Yeah, FSH and LH, collectively they're known as the gonadotropins. Okay, what else? Prolactin, right? That's the one that stimulates milk secretion. Okay. She said TSH before. What else? What is it? Corticotropin, also known as ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. Okay. Any others?
Melanin?
Yeah, MSH, melanocyte stimulating hormone, also comes from there. Okay. Those are the principal ones. Okay. All right. Now, most of them that are coming from the hypothalamus, most of them are releasing hormones. So, give me an example. What causes ACTH to be released by the anterior pituitary? CRH. Remember, there's a corticotropin releasing hormone that comes from the hypothalamus and then causes ACTH to be released. Okay. Let's see, what's another one? There's a TRH, a thyrotropin releasing hormone that goes from the hypothalamus, goes to the anterior pituitary, causes TSH to be released. Okay. What causes FSH and LH to be released? Yeah, GnRH, gonadotropin-releasing hormone they're coming from. So there's that whole kind of what they call like the hypothalamus-pituitary axis of things that are affecting each other. Okay. Make sure you go through those little tables there and know what the anterior pituitaries are and like, what they affect. Make sure you're in pretty good shape. Right. How many cell types are there in the anterior pituitary? Does anyone know? How many hormones are there? There's 7 hormones. How many cell types? It's actually 5 cell types. Okay, so look at the names of those cells. Make sure you know what those guys are. Posterior pituitary then is a lot simpler. You don't have to worry about the releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones. It's a direct neuron connection with the hypothalamus. You mentioned the 2 hormones already. Somebody said oxytocin. What does oxytocin do?
Milk ejection.
It causes milk ejection. What else does it do?
Contraction of the uterus.
Yeah, contraction of the uterus during childbirth to help force the baby out. Okay? Basically, it's a stimulator of smooth muscle, right? In the breast, it's stimulating little smooth muscle that causes the milk ejection. In the uterus, it's stimulating the smooth muscle there to cause to try to squeeze the baby out. What does ADH do?
Water.
Water reabsorption in the kidneys, right? Is it water plus sodium or just pure water?
Water plus.
For ADH?
Oh,
It's just pure water. Okay, antidiuretic hormone just causes pure water reabsorption. What's the hormone that causes sodium plus water to be reabsorbed? That's aldosterone. Okay, that comes from someplace else. What else does ADH do besides this water reabsorption? Anyone? It's well, what's its other name? Vasopressin, right? What does that mean? It does.
It keeps you from.
Yeah, it's also a direct constrictor of blood vessels, so it has that effect too. ADH secretion varies based on basically what's called the blood osmotic pressure. Okay, that's the concentration of your blood. How concentrated is your blood? That's known as the blood osmotic pressure. When it's really concentrated, in other words, when there's lots of sodium and lots of cells and not that much fluid, it's an indication that you're dehydrated. So then your posterior pituitary releases the ADH, causes you to hold on to more water, which helps bring down the concentration of your blood or bring down what's called the blood osmotic pressure. Okay. It gets you hydrated, holds on to more water. Let's see, we talked about some pituitary gland disorders. What's it called if you have too much human growth hormone released when you're a child? Gigantism, right? And because your growth plates haven't fused yet, you get to be super tall, right? What's it called if you have too much growth hormone released when you're an adult? Acromegaly, okay? Basically, you're not getting taller in height per se because your growth plates have already fused, but in different areas where there's still active bone cells, like in your at the ends of your bones and like in your jaw bones and things, you can get excess bone being laid down, and it can cause like characteristic facial features and things. All right. What's the difference between diabetes insipidus and diabetes mellitus?
One
Which is the more common one?
mellitus.
Mellitus, right? That's your sugar diabetes, and that's a problem with what? It's a problem with insulin in some way. Either you're not making enough insulin, or the cells have lost their sensitivity to insulin, and you end up having high what in your blood? High blood glucose levels. Okay. What happens with diabetes insipidus? You can't retain water. You basically have no what? What's the hormone? You don't have any ADH, right? Without having any ADH, you lose tremendous amounts of water. You're peeing all the time. You become very dehydrated. So that's diabetes insipidus. Yeah.
Mellitus. What does that mean? Does that mean something to do with sugar or anything?
I believe so. I think it does have something like making sweet tasting or something. I used to. That's one of those things I'm pretty sure I used to know. I'm not. Does anyone know the origin of mellitus? All right, then my answer is correct. Let's see here. Okay, thyroid gland. What are the hormones that come from the thyroid gland? T3 and T4, right? And those are your thyroid hormones, and those are the only hormones that come from the thyroid gland, right?
No.
What? Those are thyroid hormones. What else is there? Calcitonin, right? T3 and T4, they increase your metabolic rate. They make cells very metabolically active. What does calcitonin do?
Lowers
Down
blood
calcium.
Lowers blood calcium levels. Okay. Does anyone remember how what's the antagonist hormone to calcitonin?
Thyroid hormone.
PTH, parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone raises blood calcium levels. Calcitonin tones down blood calcium levels. How does calcitonin tone down or reduce blood calcium levels?
Or
It stimulates bone growth, right? It stimulates the osteoblasts. The osteoblasts take the calcium out of the blood. They use the calcium to make bone, and so your blood calcium levels go down. PTH stimulates what kind of cells? Osteoclasts. They eat away at the bone. They free up the calcium, and your blood calcium levels go up. All right. What's significant about the thyroid gland in terms of its hormones? It's the only endocrine gland that what? Stores its hormone in significant amounts, right? What's that junk in the middle of a thyroid follicle called? Colloid, right? And when the thyroid gland wants to secrete T3 and T4, it basically gobbles up some of that colloid. It chews it up, and then it releases the T3s and the T4s into the bloodstream. Now, what do you need in your diet in order to make T3 and T4?
Iodine.
You need to have iodine. Okay? What happens if you don't have iodine?
You get a goiter.
You get a goiter, which is a what? It's a big swollen thyroid gland. Okay? The reason why it happens is that if you don't have iodine in your diet, you absolutely can't make T3 and T4, but your anterior pituitary doesn't get the message. All the anterior pituitary is seeing is that you don't have any T3 and T4, so its response is to churn out more of the TSH. It keeps churning out more TSH in an effort to stimulate T3 and T4 synthesis, but if you don't have iodine, you're not going to get it. However, the TSH does go and stimulate the growth of the thyroid tissue, which is why you get this big swollen goiter. But no matter how big that goiter gets, if you don't have iodine in your diet, you're never going to be able to make T3 and T4. All right. Okay. All right. Adrenal glands. Where do they sit anatomically?
On top of the kidney.
Yeah, they sit on top of the kidneys, and they're adherent to the renal glands. What's the other name for the adrenal glands?
Suprarenal.
Suprarenal glands. Okay. What's the outer part of the adrenal gland called? Cortex. What's the inner part called? The medulla. Okay. What going through the cortex from outside to in? What are the three zones? What's the first zone you come to?
Zona glomerulosa.
Zona glomerulosa, then the fasciculata, and then the reticularis. What does the glomerulosa secrete? Mineralocorticoids, which are principally, which is what hormone principally? Aldosterone. Okay, what does the fasciculata secrete? Glucocorticoids, which in your body is principally what? Cortisol. Okay, cortisol is the principal glucocorticoid. And then what does the reticularis secrete?
Androgens.
Androgens. Okay, so does anyone remember the memory trick from outside to in?
Salt, sugar, sex.
Yeah, salt, sugar, sex. Okay, so that helps. Salt, sugar, sex. Okay. So let's see here. The aldosterone, important then for causing the reabsorption of sodium in the kidneys. Where sodium goes, water follows. Does anyone remember the cation that's simultaneously secreted while the sodium's being reabsorbed? Potassium, right? Remember that the convoluted way that you can get aldosterone to be secreted? Remember that RAAS system, right? The renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system? That whole thing kicks in when your blood pressure and your blood volume is low. And you got to go through all these different things and stuff to finally get the aldosterone. But the other way that you trigger aldosterone release is if you have high blood potassium levels. That's a direct stimulator, and you'll churn out aldosterone, and aldosterone will cause you to pee out potassium in your urine, which will quickly bring down your blood potassium levels, because high blood potassium levels are bad. Yeah, they're really bad. Okay. All right. Let's see here. Some of the things that the glucocorticoids do. Glucocorticoids, principally we're talking about cortisol. Okay. Synthetic forms of like cortisol are what they give you like as an immunosuppressive drug, like if you have autoimmune disease or if you've got a transplant, they may give you prolonged steroids, things like prednisone, etc. Have a lot of effects, a lot of nasty effects. What do you things like cortisol cause? Anyone remember? Facial abnormalities. Okay, they cause protein breakdown all over the place, which can definitely change how your body appears. They promote glucose formation, something called gluconeogenesis, where you're forming glucose from things like amino acids and fatty acids. They also promote lipolysis, which is the breakdown of the triglycerides. If anyone ever talks about the stress hormone, they're specifically referring to cortisol. It's released during times of stress. Basically, its big role, it's a glucocorticoid, its big role is to liberate or free up lots of glucose for the body cells to have as an energy source during whatever the particular stress is. The glucocorticoids have anti-inflammatory effects, they depress the immune responses, so all kinds of things. All right, let's see here. You mentioned before the hormones that come from the adrenal medulla, epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are part of what autonomic nervous system thing? They're part of the sympathetic. Okay, they're there. They kind of prolong the sympathetic response. As long as those things are, this is why I say, like when you're chased by a bear or whatever, you're freaking out, you're breathing fast, and you're running, your heart's like pumping, and you're just like generally freaking out. You don't stop freaking out just because your friend kills that bear, right? For a good period of time after the bear is dead, even when you know that you don't have anything to fear, your heart's still pumping and all this other stuff is still happening. And that's because the epinephrine, the norepinephrine coming from the adrenal medulla, as long as it's in your bloodstream, you're going to have this stimulatory effect. So that's why a sympathetic response lasts longer than a parasympathetic response. Okay? All right. Pancreas. By law, every textbook has to say what is the first sentence about the pancreas?
Mix endocrine and exocrine.
Yeah, it's both an endocrine and exocrine gland. Okay, by law it has to say that. We spent time talking about the endocrine part. Like roughly what percentage, like by weight, of the pancreas is endocrine?
9.
It's like 2% is endocrine. The other 98% is exocrine. What are the exocrine parts called? Acini or acini. These guys you haven't learned about yet. You'll learn about when we get to what system? Anyone know? Digestive system. They make a lot of important digestive enzymes. The pancreas is an incredibly important organ. It does all those digestive enzymes. But we focused on the endocrine stuff for now. Histologically, what are those little areas that are endocrine? The islets, right? The pancreatic islets or the islets of Langerhans. And what's the main hormone that's released by the pancreatic islets? Insulin. And that's released by what cells?
Beta.
The beta cells. Okay? So it's like 70% of the islet cells are beta cells and they produce insulin. Insulin does what to blood sugar levels?
Lowers that.
It lowers them. Okay? Basically, it helps glucose get into your body cells. The next most common type of hormone from the pancreas is what? Glucagon. And what does it do? It's just the opposite. It's an antagonistic hormone to insulin. It raises blood glucose levels. All right. So when you've just eaten, what hormone does your pancreas churn out a lot of after you've just eaten? Insulin, because your blood glucose levels are going to be high after you've just eaten. The insulin helps them get into the body cells. When it's been a few hours and you're starting to get hungry, what hormone does your body release? Glucagon, which will start breaking down glucose stores like in the liver, etc., release it into the blood, which will help like meet the metabolic needs of your body until you get a chance to eat. Okay. Are those the only cells that you have in the pancreatic islets? No. What else do you have? Delta cells. What do they do? Somatostatin. What does somatostatin do? It shuts everything down. I think I said this before. It's like the ultimate party pooper hormone. It shuts down insulin release. It shuts down the glucagon release. It does all kinds of things. It's also released, somatostatin is also released by the hypothalamus, and it shuts down the release of human growth hormone from the anterior pituitary. So it does a lot of things, a lot of turning off of stuff. And then lastly, there was something called PP cells, and they release pancreatic polypeptide. It helps influence digestive function. We then went on to the ovaries, and we talked about some of the hormones there. What kind of hormones come from the ovaries? Estrogen, progesterone. Keep in mind, like I said before, estrogen is a group, okay? It's made up of a lot of different hormones like estradiol and estrone are some examples. Okay. Estrogen stimulates follicle development, among other things. It stimulates the growth of the endometrium. Progesterone does what to the endometrium? It maintains it. It's the progestation hormone, right? What's another hormone? What's the hormone that causes the pubic symphysis to kind of spread apart? Relaxin, that comes from the ovaries. What's the one that goes and blocks the release of FSH from the inhibin? Okay, that's another one. Then we went on to the testes, and I was teaching my son about the testes last night. I was giving him all. He was giving me all kinds of slangs. It's like, is that what this is? Is that what we refer to it? I'm like, yeah, that's right. Please don't use slang in the class. I can't use slang or I'll get in trouble. All right, the male gonads. Okay, fine. They lie inside the scrotum. Okay. Why do they have to be inside this like special bag that's external to your body? Yeah, it's for temperature. They have to be like 2 to 3 degrees lower centigrade for spermatogenesis to occur. Right? Okay, let's see here. Pineal gland. Talked about what's the hormone from the pineal gland? Melatonin. I'm not even going to try to mess you up anymore. It's melatonin, and it's actually derived from serotonin. And it's your sleep hormone, right? Melatonin levels are released. They're high when it's like nighttime and things outside. All right. We talked about the thymus. I think it's better for a lymphatic system organ, but the thymus does a hormone called thymosin, which stimulates T cell development. All right. Stress response. What were the 3 parts of the stress response? What's it called when you first get stressed about something and your heart starts to race and your pupils dilate? That's the flight or fight response. That's the first stage, and that's mediated by what? That's caused by the sympathetic nervous system, okay, kicking in. Then you have a resistance reaction. That's the second phase. That's occurring as the adrenal glands are starting to churn out high amounts of cortisol. Okay? Usually at this stage, and that's going to make glucose available and things like that. Usually at this stage in the game, that's when most people will overcome their stress. They'll get past it, and things will go, homeostasis will get back to normal, and that will be the end of the stress response for most people. But if it's a severe stress or it's a prolonged stress, you may go into the third phase where you basically wear out your adrenal glands, you wear out other tissues in the body, and what's that stage called? Exhaustion. Okay. All right. What are some of the changes you see, like during the fight or flight, during the sympathetic response? What are some of the body changes you see? What's that? Increased heart rate. Yeah. What else? Dilate pupils to see like as much as you can see. Right. Yeah, your digestive system basically shuts down, right? And your reproductive system shuts down. Okay. Nothing sucks more than being chased by the bear and then trying to get it on with like your girlfriend as you're running. That doesn't work. I never thought about the reproductive system shutting down, but you're absolutely correct. The reproductive system shuts down. Yeah, but the digestive system, you start shunting blood away from like the stomach and the intestines, and you move it. Where does the blood flow tend to go instead? Skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and also to the brain. Okay, those are some of the things going on. All right, development of the endocrine system. The endocrine system comes from basically all different kinds of tissues. Embryonically, it's coming from all 3 germ layers. What are the 3 germ layers? Ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. All right, so it comes from a wide range of places. Secretion of male hormones versus female hormones. What can you say comparing the 2? It stops in which gender?
Oh, women.
No, it
Female.
stops in females, right?
Female.
During menopause, you have basically the ovaries shutting down, and you don't get the estrogen coming out like it was. In men, on the other hand, they maintain secretion with only a slight drop. Okay. All right, I think that's all I wanted to say about the endocrine chapter. Any questions about the endocrine chapter? No questions like, do we need to know? None of those kind of questions? I mean, I'm going to say yes, but it's always fun to hear it.
It's 100 questions.
It's 100, yeah, just to reiterate, it's 100 questions, a Scantron type exam, and you get basically a full lecture period, so you're going to have 80 minutes to finish it. Okay. All right. Question. And again, as I mentioned, if you came in late, all of them are multiple choice this time. All 100 are multiple choice. All right, chapter 28 then, this is the reproductive system chapter. Kind of went through the male system first, then we went to the female system. We talked about the quote-unquote gonads first, then we talked about the various ducts, then we talked about accessory sex glands, and then we talked about supporting structures. All right, let's see here. So, let's go through the male system then first. What are the gonads in the males? Testes. Okay. Now, what are all the different ducts that you have in the male reproductive system? Take me from, okay, where did the sperm get formed? Seminiferous tubules. Then, where does the sperm go to next? Straight tubules. Then,
The rate testis.
the rete testis. Then, efferent ducts or efferent tubules. Then where? Epididymis. And then where? Vas deferens. And then ejaculatory duct. And then prostatic urethra. Then membranous. Then penile or spongy urethra. Right. So that was the kind of the pathway there. What were the sex glands that you have in men? You have two.
Bulb urethra.
Bulbar urethra glands, and how many of those? Two. What else? Seminal vesicles. How many of those? Two. And then what's the only unpaired?
Prostate.
The prostate. If you look at a testy, all right. What do you call the tough white coat that surrounds the testes? The tunica albuginea, all right? If you look, then if you did like a cross section of the testis, you looked inside, that's where you'd find the seminiferous tubules, okay? They're divided into little lobules. Each lobule has like 1 to 3 seminiferous tubules inside of it. And again, the seminiferous tubules are where the sperm is made. Okay? Spermatogenesis. When does spermatogenesis start in men?
Puberty.
At puberty, and then it continues throughout life. Okay. What are the two hormones that are principally involved in spermatogenesis? FSH and testosterone. Okay. They're the guys that stimulate spermatogenesis. Obviously, you got to have some assistance from some of the other hormones, but those are the main stimulators. Okay. Testosterone comes from what cells?
Those Leydig cells?
Yeah, the Leydig cells, also known as the interstitial cells. Okay. FSH, of course, comes from the anterior pituitary. Okay. Testosterone levels, I guess I should back up. The testosterone comes from the Leydig cells and the interstitial cells. Those guys are stimulated to produce the testosterone by what? Remember? It's LH. So it's LH from the anterior pituitary stimulates the Leydig cells to produce the testosterone. Testosterone then diffuses into the nearby seminiferous tubules to stimulate spermatogenesis. Okay? But levels have to be really high of the testosterone in the seminiferous tubules, right? Testosterone is a lipid-soluble hormone. How do you keep the testosterone from leaking out of the tubules once it gets inside? Yeah, ABP, androgen binding peptide or protein. And that's where the FSH comes in. FSH goes to and stimulates the sustenacular cells, also known as the nerve cells, also known as the Sertoli cells. It causes them to secrete the ABP so that when the testosterone comes into the seminiferous tubules, the ABP binds with it and keeps the testosterone in the tubules, and you need high levels of testosterone for spermatogenesis to occur. Okay. All right. Talking about spermatogenesis, what type of cell division do you have to do? You have to do meiosis, same thing that you have to do with oogenesis. Okay. When you begin spermatogenesis, like what are what are the great-great-grandfather cells, if you will, that start the thing off? Those are spermatogonia. What do you call them in females? Oogonia, right? And these cells are what? In terms of chromosome number, how many chromosomes they have?
46.
They have 46, also known as being diploid, also known as being 2N. How do I write it so it looks like your way? All right. Anyway, 2N. So that's what starts things off with these spermatogonia. The spermatogonia go on to become what? They differentiate. They don't divide yet, but they differentiate and become what? Primary spermatocytes, right? The primary spermatocytes still have 46 chromosomes. The primary spermatocytes undergo meiosis 1, and then they're known as what? Secondary spermatocytes. And how many chromosomes do they have?
23.
They have 23, and then the secondary spermatocytes, they undergo meiosis 2, and you end up having 4 spermatids, each of which has 23 chromosomes. So testosterone, let's see, I mentioned important, directly stimulates the final steps of spermatogenesis. Testosterone also important during fetal development. Okay, early on in a pregnancy, if you have a male baby, you need to have a surge in testosterone levels, like around the 7th or 8th week. And if you have that surge, it's going to lead to development of the testes and lead to development of the external genitals. If you don't have it, then you're going to get undeveloped, or you're going to go on to have more female-appearing genitals. Okay. All right. Androgens are what are the kind of hormones called that build stuff? Anabolic hormones. Okay, so androgens an anabolic hormone, just like growth hormone is. Estrogen's an anabolic hormone. Went through that thing already. Semen. Okay, how many sperm do you typically have in a milliliter of semen? How much?
200
206?
million.
I think it's pretty sure it's 27. No, it's 50 to 150 million sperm per milliliter of semen. If you go below the magic number, it's like 20 million per milliliter, then you might have problems with fertility. Okay, so it's the glands then that make the actual semen. Okay, and the glands each have different secretions. So anatomically, as like the sperm are being made and they're moving from the testes to the epididymis and things, what's the first gland that the sperm encounter as they're kind of leaving? The seminal vesicles are the first ones that they come across. Okay, what kind of fluid is coming from this? First of all, what percentage of the semen is coming from the seminal vesicles? It's the majority of it, which is about 60%. Okay, just a ballpark figure. And what is the what's the pH of the fluid? It's basic. It's alkaline. And what do you find in the fluid from the seminal vesicles? What'd you say? Acid? No, not so much acid. It's more basic. You find an energy source for the sperm.
ATP.
Not ATP.
Glucose.
It's an isomer of glucose. Fructose. You find fructose.
I knew it was something like that.
So it's high in fructose. The prostate then is the next gland you come to. It does about 25% of the semen volume. The prostate secretion, though, is more acidic. Why is it acidic? What does it produce as an energy source? Not fructose, but citric acid. Okay, so citric acid is going to be used. You can feed that into the citric acid cycle and make ATP from it. Okay. And some other things here. Oh, okay. And then lastly, the smallest ones are the bulbourethral glands. They secrete a very alkaline, mucousy type secretion that's thought to protect against physical trauma. Okay. Aside from the prostate, though, the seminal vesicles and the bulbourethral glands, it's mostly alkaline, which is going to work to counteract the acidic environment in the female reproductive tract. So that's the reason for that. All right, scrotum, you mentioned it's there to keep the testes from to be cold, to promote spermatogenesis. Does anyone remember the two muscles that can change the elevation of the testes and change things.
Cremaster muscle.
The cremaster muscle, right? Anyone try the cremaster reflex? You don't have to answer. The cremaster muscle, and then what's the other one? The dartos muscle. Okay, so those both can contract and can control how close to the body cavity the testes are. Okay. What's the spermatocord? That's basically the structure that the testis hangs off of, okay, that it's connected to. It consists of the cremaster muscle, but then it consists in, if you look inside of the spermatocord, you have the vas deferens, you have arteries, you have veins, you have nerves, you have lymphatics. They're all running inside of there. What's the name of that passageway that the spermatocord passes through on its way into the scrotum? That's the inguinal canal. Okay? Usually when someone says they have a hernia, they're referring to an inguinal hernia, unless, you know, well, that's the most common type at any rate. The penis itself, talked about that, mostly made up of erectile tissue. What are the two parts of erectile tissue on, like, the dorsum called? The corpora cavernosa, and then the one on the ventral surface is the corpus spongiosum. Where do you find the urethra going through? The corpus spongiosum. Okay. The penis is held up by a couple of ligaments that support it. There's what's called the fundiform ligament that's attached to the linea alba, the white line that's between your rectus abdominis muscles. And then there's another ligament called the suspensory ligament that comes off of the pubic symphysis that helps hold it in place also. All right. All right. Male sexual response has to do with the autonomic nervous system. What division is in charge of the erection? Parasympathetic. What's in charge of the ejaculation? Sympathetic. Good. All right. Then we went on to the female reproductive system. What are the gonads in the females?
Ovaries.
Ovaries. Good. The ducts are principally then the uterine tubes, also known as the fallopian tubes, also known as the oviducts. And then you have the different glands in the female as well. The paraurethral glands, which are analogous actually to the prostate, the greater vestibular glands, also known as the Bartholin glands, which are analogous to the seminal vesicles, and then the lesser vestibular glands, which are like the bulbourethral glands. Female supporting structures, uterus, vagina, and vulva. What's the vulva? It's a fancy name for what? It's not a car. Don't think it's a car. Yeah, it's just the external genitals. Okay. What was the derogatory name? Crudendum. All right. I say it's derogatory. I mean, I think people still use it. I don't think too many people know the origin, so you're not going to be like, you know, thrown against the wall if you use it. I don't think most people know what it means. All right. The ovaries are oval-shaped organs. They're held in the pelvic cavity. There's suspensory ligaments that attach them to the pelvic wall and hold them in place. Let's see here. Primary role of the oocytes is to produce the secondary, the primary role of the ovaries is to produce the secondary oocytes and then release one each month. Okay. What does a secondary oocyte become if it gets fertilized? It becomes an ovum. All right. The name changes at that point. Okay. I mentioned before, it's the ovaries don't just make the oocytes, though. They also produce those different hormones that I mentioned. Okay, let's see. Where does fertilization occur? In the fallopian tubes, in the infundibulum. Okay. Usually, or possibly like more along in the ampulla, but somewhere usually in the outer third of the fallopian tubes. Okay, yeah. Where does the fertilized egg implant? In the uterus, right? What's it called when it doesn't implant in the uterus but someplace else? Ectopic pregnancy. Does anyone remember the name of the ligaments that hold the uterus to the sides of the pelvic cavity? They're called the broad ligaments. Okay. There's also a ligament that holds it to the posterior part of the pelvic cavity. The uterosacral ligaments hold that in place there. What's it called when those as you get older and those ligaments start to weaken? What's it called when this? Yeah, uterine prolapse, and it starts coming outside of your body. It can start poking out, falling, and possibly get outside your body. All right. let's see here. What are the parts of the uterus called? What's the main part, the central part
Body.
called? That's the body. Okay. The inner part is called the uterine cavity. What's the bulging sort of superior
Fundus.
part called? The fundus. And then what's the narrow like outlet?
Cervix.
The cervix. Okay. Now inside the cervix you have a little passageway called the cervical canal. The opening that goes out into the vagina is called the what?
Os.
The external os, and then the one that goes towards the uterine cavity? Internal os. Good. Histologically, if you look at the wall of the uterus, what are the three layers? What's the innermost layer? Endometrium, then the myometrium, then the outer layer, the parametrium, which is essentially just a bit of the peritoneum. Okay. Let's see. The vagina then, talked about that. Serve as a passageway for menstrual flow, forms the lower birth canal, and it's a receptacle for penis during sexual intercourse. It's weird coinciding with the release of Shades of Grey or whatever. I don't write all these things. Sometimes I got to go back and edit these things. They just sound so silly later on when I read it. All right. Talked about the vulva, the different parts there. The glands I mentioned as well, paraurethral glands. What does para mean? Around or near. So those are the glands that open near the urethra. Okay. They secrete mucus. Most of the glands in the women are producing mucus, which just serves as a lubricant during sexual intercourse. What's that triangle? What's that diamond-shaped area that you have in men and in women that kind of encompasses the general region?
Perineum.
The perineum, right?
Perineum.
And what are the boundaries of the perineum? Okay, so the ischial tuberosities are like the lateral boundaries. What's the anterior boundary of the perineum? What? No.
Oh, you said.
The anterior boundary, yeah. That's all right. The pubic symphysis, right? So you draw it from the pubic symphysis. So, pubic symphysis. Okay. And it then goes over and goes to the ischial tuberosities, aka your butt bones. And then where's this spot back here?
Anus.
So it's not the anus, what is it?
Oh, the coccyx?
It's the tip of the coccyx.
Couldn't see through you.
I'm sorry. Alright, so you got that. They like to divide the two up into different triangles. What's this one called? That's the urogenital triangle, right? That's where the penis and the genitals are, and then this is the anal triangle. Okay. All right, the mammary glands are in charge of producing milk. What hormone stimulates milk production? Prolactin, and then what causes the ejection? Oxytocin. All right. Oogenesis, unlike in men, oogenesis begins in females before they're even born. Okay, keep that in mind. During childhood, the eggs that are still around that haven't degenerated are sitting around and basically arrested in prophase 1. Okay? It's only then with each monthly cycle, when puberty starts, that they then go on and develop further. Okay? Keep in mind the different levels of the follicles. So you start off with these things that are called primordial follicles. They then develop into primary follicles, which then develop into secondary follicles. And then finally, what's the last follicle type that you have? That likes to rupture? It's a mature follicle or a Graafian follicle, all those things. And usually there's only one dominant one each month, but not necessarily. Sometimes, particularly if you're receiving some kind of a fertility treatment to try to get you to ovulate, you can have more than one quote-unquote mature follicle. As I mentioned, look at those follicles. Look at the anatomy of the follicles in the book. Make sure you know all those parts. There's a few questions I know about the parts. Okay. when fertilization, and I think we'll get into this later, but when fertilization occurs, you have fusion of the male's DNA with the female's DNA. What's that very first cell called? The zygote. Okay. And how many chromosomes? 46, 2N. Okay. All right. Female reproductive cycle then starts from, what's the point when you have the first menstrual period called? Menarche. And then the last one? Menopause. Okay. Each cycle takes around 28 days. I think you know that. What are the phases then, or what are the what's the first phase? Assume a 28-day cycle. Well, the first one is menses. That's days 1 through 5. Then what? Pre-ovulatory, which is days 6 through 13. Then what happens at 14? Ovulation. And then like 15 through 28 is post-ovulation. So obviously during this phase, the lining of the uterus is being shed. It's being shed because progesterone levels are low at this point. Without the progesterone to maintain the uterine lining gets shed. As soon as it's shed, though, estrogen coming from the ovaries starts to stimulate the regrowth of a new endometrium. So during this phase, during the pre-ovulatory phase, the endometrium is starting to thicken. FSH is coming from the anterior pituitary. It's stimulating the ovaries to release estrogen. The FSH is promoting the development of the follicles, and eventually you'll have a dominant follicle. So that by the time you get to day 14, what triggers ovulation? It's a surge in LH levels. Okay. The LH then, after the surge, you have the secondary oocyte being released. But does the follicle just disappear? No, it sticks around and becomes the what? Corpus luteum. So with the LH still being around, the corpus luteum lives on, and the corpus luteum churns out high amounts of what? Progesterone. And so long as there's progesterone during days 15 through 28, the uterine lining that had grown back, it stays alive, it's maintained. But then eventually, assuming you're not getting pregnant, LH levels will naturally fall. When LH levels fall, the corpus luteum dies. When the corpus luteum dies, there's no progesterone, and you start back up here with the bleeding, the shedding of the endometrium. Okay. What if fertilization does occur during that phase? What happens? The corpus luteum stays active. Why? Well, that's what it does, but what keeps the corpus luteum alive? Some hormones. What's the hormone that's it's coming from the trophoblast? It's coming from the chorion. HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin, comes from the developing embryo. It comes from the chorion layer, and it keeps the corpus luteum alive and secretes it so that it keeps the progesterone going, so that so that it's not shed. All right. Just glance at the different birth control methods. I wouldn't go obsessive about remembering the different percentages, but if you just have some concept of like what they involve, you know, like what a vasectomy involves, what a tubal ligation involves, you know, how the oral contraceptives work, that sort of thing. There may be like 1 or 2 questions, but certainly don't go nuts memorizing the percentages. I mean, I think you should. Yeah, I think you should know probably like the withdrawal method has a crappy rate. You know, you probably should know that, but you don't need to know like the fine details of the other thing. All right, development of the reproductive systems. The internal reproductive systems develop from different ducts. Okay. What is the internal male? What are the name of the ducts that the internal male reproductive system develops from? The Wolffian ducts. Okay. And what do the females develop from? Mullerian ducts. Okay. keep in mind, like I said before, early on during development, you have to have high levels of testosterone for the male genitals to develop. Specifically, it's a variant of testosterone called DHT, dihydrotestosterone. That has to be high early on by about 8 weeks in order for normal male genitals to develop. And if you have a Y chromosome, you should have high levels early on. Right. What's that called in men when the prostate gland enlarges? Not when it's cancer, but it just enlarges. Benign prostatic hyperplasia, or sometimes they say benign prostatic hypertrophy. Most men have it. What are some of the symptoms you can get from it? Peeing a lot. What else?
Being able to empty.
Yeah, not fully emptying your bladder. Peeing a lot at night. What's that called? Nocturia. Okay, so all those things. What's amenorrhea? Yeah, no menstruation. Dysmenorrhea, what's that?
Painful.
It's painful menstruation. All right, then we went on to chapter 29. Try to look through this as fast as I can. So, chapter 29, development, inheritance. We spent a lot of time talking about the embryonic period, which is what weeks of pregnancy? 1 through 8. It's up to the 8th week, and then after that, you're called what? A fetus. Okay. What do you call during the first 28 days of life? A neonate. Okay, that's the neonatal period. Okay. Now, first week, then you got fertilization occurring. What's the change called that the sperm have to undergo in the female reproductive tract that makes them ready?
Capitization.
Yeah, capacitation. I knew what you meant. It causes their tails to beat more vigorously. It weakens the acrosomes so that the enzymes can start to come out. But that basically gets the sperm prepared to fertilize the egg. Okay. When a sperm meets up with the egg, is the egg just sitting there all by itself with nothing around it?
No.
No. What's surrounding the egg?
Corona radiata.
The corona radiata, which is basically some granulosa cells, and then inside of that, what do you have?
Zona pellucida.
The zona pellucida, which is some glycoprotein layers that the sperm has to get through as well. So there's first those 2 layers before sperm even gets to the cell membrane of the egg itself. I should back up. Difference between spermatogenesis and oogenesis. How many viable gametes do you get when one primary spermatocyte goes through its process? 4. How about with one primary oocyte? Just one. What happens to the losers?
3
that don't
polar
get
bodies.
They become polar bodies, right? They're
Losers.
tiny and they're All right. Let's see here. Okay. Yep. So the nuclei, the sperm and the egg have to fuse. It's actually called a pronucleus. The male pronucleus, the female pronucleus, they fuse and they form one nucleus. Does anyone remember the process or the name of that process when the nuclei fuse? Syngamy. Okay. And that's when it's actually when those pronuclei fuse that you start then referring to it as a zygote. What are the rapid cell divisions that occur during the first week? Cleavage. Remember that? So rapid cell divisions occurring. That's when you go from the zygote to the 2-cell stage, the 4-cell stage, and so on. What's that mass of cells that you get? Not a solid mass of cells. What's that called? The morula. What's it called when it becomes hollowed out on the inside? Blastocyst. Okay. It's the blastocyst that shows up in the uterine cavity. About how many days does it take from the fertilized egg to become a blastocyst and then show up into the uterine cavity?
5 or 6.
I'd say 5 days is a good ballpark figure, somewhere around that. And then by about day 7, it's actually implanted into the lining of the uterus. Okay. What are the 2 parts that I asked on the lab quiz? But what are the 2 parts to the blastocyst? What's the outer part called?
Trophoblast.
The trophoblast. And what's the inner part called?
Embryoblast.
Okay.
Is it also called the embryoblast?
It's also called an embryoblast. Okay. The trophoblast goes on. It's going to be formed. The syncytiotrophoblast, the cytotrophoblast. Basically, it's going to work to become that chorion that's going to contribute to the placenta. The inner cell mass, on the other hand, becomes the amniotic cavity. It becomes the yolk sac, and then most importantly, it becomes the embryo itself, where the 2 layers of the inner cell mass meet. Okay. At first, when the embryo is developing, it's just made up of 2 layers, okay, something called the epiblast and the hypoblast. But through this process called gastrulation, you get a 3rd layer forming, and once that happens, you have the 3 primary germ layers. What are the 3 primary germ layers? Ectoderm, endoderm, and mesoderm. Yep, as I mentioned, the chorion and the trophoblast that it came from, that secretes the HCG that keeps the corpus luteum alive. But eventually, after a few months though, the chorion stops producing the HCG and the corpus luteum dies. Okay, is that a problem? No, why not? Because the placenta has taken over and started to secrete what? Its own progesterone, which keeps the pregnancy going. Okay. The amnion is thin protective membrane, and inside you have the amniotic fluid, which acts kind of like a cushion for the baby. The amniotic cavity has the fluid inside. What does the yolk sac do? Supplies nutrients to the embryo early on, but not a lot. It's not like a yolk sac that you have like in birds or something, not a lot. It also is an early source for blood cells. Also produces the germ cells that become the spermatogonia and the oogonia. All right. While gastrulation is occurring, you also have this other process a little bit later on called neurulation, when the central nervous system is starting to develop. What are those disorders called when you don't have enough folate in your diet? Neural tube defects. And what are some specific examples? What's it called when you don't have a brain? Anencephaly. Okay. What's it called when you have like a big opening in your back? And spina bifida. All right. Cardiovascular development comes a little bit later on. The heart starts pumping. Chorionic villi. So the chorionic villi are these little finger-like projections that represent the fetal side of the placenta. What's the purpose of the placenta? Exchange of nutrients and waste products between the mom's blood and the baby's blood without what ever happening? Without the blood itself ever mixing. Okay, it's a safe way to exchange things. Okay. Let's see here. Embryonic folding, very good. Fetal period you mentioned. What's a teratogen? It's a monster generator, right? It's any chemical that causes defects in the embryo or any influence. Okay. What's the most common teratogen in the United States? Alcohol. Okay, and it causes, what's the syndrome? Fetal alcohol syndrome, mental retardation, and it's obviously totally preventable. Cigarette smoke also has a adverse effect. Ways to assess the baby: fetal ultrasound, right? You can determine like what help estimate what the age is. You can determine gender, other things. Amniocentesis: you're taking a little bit of amniotic fluid around 14 to 16 weeks of gestation. You're looking at the amniotic fluid. You can do CVS, chorionic villus sampling, earlier than amnio and look for the same things. What else? Yeah, obviously there's a lot of material to go through. Hopefully some of this stuff though that we just did, hopefully the stuff in this chapter will be like fresh in your memory. Let's see what else. If there's anything in particular I want to mention. Make sure you know the stages of labor. What happens during the first stage? You have dilation of the cervix. Okay. What's the magic number that you want to get to?
10.
10. So the stage 1, 10 centimeters. Yeah, not 10 feet, not 10 inches. 10 centimeters. So stage 1, contractions begin to the point that the cervix is at 10 centimeters. What's the next stage when the baby comes out? Stage 2, or the stage of expulsion. And then the stage 3 is what?
Afterbirth.
When the placenta comes out. Okay. All right. I think that's about all in particular I have time to go over. Any burning questions about anything that I didn't get a chance to cover? Where's recitation? Let's see, that's a good question. Well, it's going to be tomorrow. It's in, what is it, West 246? Yeah, it's the room now, West 246.
Oh, not 248.